The first sign in some of the houses at Thistle was the doors. Doors that had shut cleanly all their lives stopped shutting because the frames had gone slightly out of square, because the ground under the town had begun, very slowly, to move. Out on the highway, cracks opened across the asphalt and had to be patched and opened again. On the slope above town, the hillside was bulging and slumping in a way the railroad men who worked the canyon had started to watch closely. Nobody at Thistle died in what happened next. That is the first thing to say, because what happened next took their whole town and gave them time to watch it go. Over the following days and weeks, the people of Thistle drove up to the ridge in the evenings and looked down at the water rising over their own houses, and there was nothing any of them could do about it. Most landslides that make the news are fast. A slope lets go, and it is over in seconds, and the danger is that it arrives before anyone can move. Thistle was the other kind. It was a reactivation of an old, deep earth flow, and it moved at something like a couple of feet an hour. You could stand and watch it happen and not be in any danger from the moving earth itself, as long as you simply walked away from it. That is exactly what the people of Thistle did. They were evacuated ahead of the water, some of them with only a couple of hours to gather what they could, and no one was hurt by the slide. The cruelty of the slow kind is a different thing. It leaves your life untouched and takes everything your life is attached to at a pace that lets you understand exactly what you are losing while you lose it. Seeing it coming did not save the town. It only gave everyone time to watch it go under. Thistle sat where Spanish Fork Canyon splits, a small railroad town, home to about 50 people by 1983, at a junction that still mattered a great deal to the Denver and Rio Grande Western. The slope above it had failed before, a long time ago. The old landslide was sitting there in the hillside, quiet, held in place by nothing more than the balance between the weight of the ground and the friction under it. Change the water in that ground, and you change the balance. The winter of 1982 into 1983 was extraordinarily wet along the Wasatch Front. A record autumn of rain soaked the ground, then a deep snowpack sat on the mountains through a long cold spring, and then the temperature rose fast and all of that snow melted at once into ground that was already full. The water worked down into the old slide surface, and the friction that had held the slope for centuries gave way. In April 1983, the ancient landslide woke up and started downhill toward the river and the town. What came down was a mass of earth about 1,000 feet wide, as much as 200 feet thick, and more than a mile long. It advanced across the floor of the canyon, hour after hour, rather than falling all at once. In its way was the Spanish Fork River and the highway beside it and the railroad. The earth pushed across all three and kept going until it met the sandstone cliff at the base of Billy's Mountain on the far side, and there it stopped and piled up and became a dam about 220 feet high. The river had nowhere to go. You could hear it in the accounts from that spring, in the sound the canyon stopped making. The Spanish Fork had run through Thistle for as long as there had been a Thistle, and now it went quiet, because it was no longer a river, but a lake that was beginning to fill. The water rose foot by foot, day after day, into the town. It took the roads first. U.S. Route 6 and U.S. Route 89 both ran through the canyon, and both went under, which cut one of the main routes across central Utah. Then it reached the tracks. The Denver and Rio Grande Western main line, the rail link between Salt Lake City and Denver, went under the lake at Thistle, and the train stopped. Then it came for the houses. It reached the lower ones first and climbed their walls, and people stood up on the ridge in the evenings and watched the water find the windows of homes they had lived in. For a while you could still see the roofs. There is a photograph from that spring of a few rooftops standing above a flat sheet of water where a town used to be. Then the water came up further, and you couldn't. The lake held around 65,000 acre-feet of water and reached about 160 feet deep at the dam. Everyone got out. Nobody drowned. The town of Thistle simply went under the surface of a lake that had not existed a month before and stayed there while the people who had lived in it watched from the high ground with nothing in their hands. While the water rose slowly, the response was anything but slow. The severed railroad was bleeding money on the order of $1 million a day in lost traffic because the main freight line between the Wasatch and the Rockies now ran into a lake. The Denver and Rio Grande Western brought in a tunnel boring machine, trucked to the canyon in 4 oversized loads, and started driving new tunnels through the rock of the canyon wall to carry the line up and around the lake. Crews worked around the clock. At the same time, engineers had to deal with the lake itself because a 200-foot dam made of loose, saturated landslide is not a thing anyone wants holding back 65,000 acre-feet above a canyon. They bored drainage tunnels through the slide to let the water down in a controlled way before the dam could fail on its own and send it down the canyon in a rush. The railroad reopened its rerouted line within a few months. The highway was rebuilt on a new alignment. The engineering worked. The town was not part of what got saved. Thistle is regularly called the most expensive landslide in United States history. Whether that is exactly true depends entirely on what you count. The direct damage came to somewhere around $200 million in 1983. Add the indirect losses, the rerouted railroad and highway, the revenue the D&R-GW lost while its line sat underwater, the coal and other freight that could not move, the businesses along a closed corridor, and the usual total is put closer to $400 million, with broader estimates and inflation pushing the figure toward $1 billion in today's terms. Those numbers are estimates, and they vary by source and by method. The direct property loss is the firmest figure. The larger totals depend on how much of the regional economic disruption you attribute to the slide, and reasonable accounts differ. What is not really in dispute is that it was, by any of these measures, the costliest landslide the country had recorded. It produced Utah's first presidential disaster declaration, which is its own kind of measure of the thing. The lake was drained. Once the tunnels carried the water off, the reservoir that had swallowed Thistle went down, and the town came back into the air. It did not come back to life. Thistle was never rebuilt. The people had been paid out and had scattered to other towns. The roads and the rail had been routed around the site, and there was no reason for anyone to return. A few structures stayed standing in ruin, a house marked by the water, an old railroad building, and they sat there emptying out year by year until a wildfire took most of what was left in 2018. The slide itself never fully settled. It moved again in 1998 after another wet winter, the same old ground shifting the same old way. And the disaster did change how the country treats this hazard, feeding the case for mapping unstable slopes and funding landslide work before the ground moves rather than after. That is stated as record. It is not the reason to care about Thistle. The reason to care about Thistle is the thing the people on the ridge went through, which has no drama in it and is worse for that. They were not in danger. They were not going to be hurt. They simply had to stand on the high ground, evening after evening, and watch a lake climb over their houses at the speed of a thing you cannot argue with, and understand each day exactly how much more of their town was gone than the day before. It started with doors that would not close. It ended with a town that is a name on a map and a stain on a standing wall. Nobody died, and that is not the same as nothing was lost. What Thistle lost was the place itself, slowly, in full view, with everyone watching and no one able to reach it. There is another one on screen about Centralia. the Pennsylvania town, that a fire underground emptied out just as completely and just as slowly.